without another. Rocks and snowballs flew, some hitting the soldiers, who quickly responded by taking up a defensive position around their prisoner. More people began to arrive, adding their voices and rocks to the fray. The officer in charge raised his weapon and sent out a warning shot. The people moved back. British soldiers had fired on a similar crowd back in March 1770, and when the smoke cleared, men lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a mariner of mixed African and Nantucket blood. In the 5 years since, the incident had become known as the Boston Massacre and stood as one of the most grievous marks against the policies of the hated King George III and his equally despised Parliament. Apparently, no one wanted to die that night. The crowd continued to hurl curses, snowballs, and chunks of ice, but the soldiers were allowed to leave with their prisoner. Chapter 1. Boston, March 1775. Faith Kingston stirred the venison stew in the big black pot hanging above the fire in her father's inn. There weren't many people inside, just a few of his loyalist friends, but he was expecting General Gage and his officers for supper shortly. "Is the stew ready, Faith?" he asked, entering the main room. Stuart Kingston was a portly man, and his face bore the dark kiss of his Jamaican heritage. He'd been in the cellar preparing the room for Gage and the others. "It will be in time, Father. Don't worry. Not many inns can boast of feeding the General, Faith. It is quite a boon for us." Even though she didn't agree, she nodded. Her dislike of the Crown and its occupying troops mirrored that of the rebels, but she kept her views to herself. Her father was a staunch loyalist. In his eyes, all the repressive laws, taxes, and soldiers were necessary to bring the rebellious colonies back under the king's rule. Moments later, the inn's door opened. Cold March air swept into the main room, bringing with it the general and his aides. Without a word, the 6 officers retired to the cellar, and Faith hurried to ladle the stew into a smaller vessel so she could serve them. As far as she knew, the general was never charged for his meals, and his lack of greeting always rankled her. Whether the discourtesy offended her father was unknown, but she was offended enough for the both of them. "Hurry, Faith," he implored her, "and don't let them find fault with your serving." At her entrance into the cellar room, the 6 men looked up and all conversation ceased. The silence held while she ladled the rich stew into their bowls, and not one of them offered the slightest acknowledgment of her presence or thanked her for her service. She set what remained of the stew in the center of the table. Offering a terse curtsy, she withdrew as silently as she'd come. However, she didn't immediately return upstairs. Instead, she quietly entered the small room next door where the inn's extra wood was kept in order to listen to what they might say. It was widely assumed that once the weather broke for good and the Concord road leading to Boston became more passable, Gage would be sending troops to root out the weapons the Sons of Liberty were amassing in anticipation of armed confrontation. There'd already been one such confrontation back in February. Troops sent to nearby Salem to confiscate suspected weapons caches had been met and opposed by a group of Minutemen led by Colonel Thomas Pickering. No shots were fired during the tense standoff, and after a compromise, the British were allowed to conduct their search. However, the rebels' cannons, shot, and guns had already been safely hidden away, so the Redcoats marched back to their Boston barracks empty-handed. This evening, Gage and his men were indeed discussing the rebels and sneering at the Minutemen's military readiness and capabilities. "They're so raw and undisciplined, the cowards will probably throw down their muskets and run in the